And we're going to pick up at about verse 12 in this section of study. To live as Christ is really kind of the theme of the entire book, and to appreciate the importance and the opportunity that we have to be believers, to benefit from a relationship with Jesus, to live a life that patterns it ourselves after His will and purposes. But in the initial, begins here of this chapter, Paul kind of introduces themselves and reminds them, where's he at? We've kind of learned this because this is the fourth of the series of letters. He's in prison. He's over in Rome in prison. From the letter that he wrote to Philemon, there is some hope that what? That he might get out. Why would we know that from the book of Philemon, that he might get out? Right. He said, I want you to get a place ready for me because I'm hoping to get there. And we learned that Philemon was from, remember at Colossae, right? He was from Colossae. And so one of these places that Paul had been writing these prison epistles to. And so it's obvious Paul had some hope that he might be able to eventually get out of prison and be able to go back and communicate with some of these locations. In verse 12, notice with me, but I would you should understand, brethren, that the things which happened unto me have fallen out rather unto the furtherance of the gospel. Now that might not be as easy as language to understand, but he's simply saying that all these things that have happened to him may appear to be hurtful, but it's actually done what? It's actually helped. It's actually given him opportunity, right? It's actually opened up some doors, some avenues, in order for him to be able to preach and teach the gospel in ways that he might not have had otherwise. Now, I want to throw this, I don't know if it's a disclaimer or a caveat, whatever you want to call it, but don't overreach that. Sometimes we'll see a text like that, and we'll say, well, God forcibly sent Paul to prison so that these things can happen. And the reason why sometimes folks will say that is they'll take anything and everything that happens to them in life and make the assumption that God made that happen and that God meant for that to happen no matter what it was. And that's not always true. Not everything that happens to us in life did God mean to happen, or God wanted to happen, or God willed to happen. There are a lot of things that just happen. Jesus taught that principle. You recall when there were some folks that came to him and wanted to know why a man was blind, and he said some things just happen. Why did the tower fall? Why? Some things just occur. There's not always. I don't believe Paul's saying, well, God created this situation. What he's simply saying is, it's the situation I found myself in, and I'm going to use it for what? I'm going to use it for good. It's the situation I found myself in. Remember, he's the one that wanted to, or had made the declaration before he goes to Jerusalem. Rewind your mind a little bit in the chronology. And everybody's telling him, don't what? Don't go, right? When you get there, it's going to be horrible. There's a prophet by the name of Agabus, right? He comes and he binds himself up to illustrate that if you go to Jerusalem, you're going to end up bound. And Paul says, no, the Lord's going to take care of me. I believe I'm going to end up in Rome. Well, he may not have realized he was going to go as a prisoner, but he knew he was going to get to Rome. And once he was there, he begins to use this situation for a good purpose. So he said, I want you to understand. When he writes to these folks at Philippi, he says, I want you to understand the things that have happened unto me, the furtherance of the gospel. You might think, well, what's the reason the Jews wanted Paul in prison to begin with? Because he was doing what? For spreading the gospel. And isn't it kind of ironic that the very thing they thought would halt him from continuing and furthering the preaching and teaching of the gospel actually turned out to be something that allowed him to what? To continue to spread the gospel, right? You know, there's interesting facets sometimes. And now, just for historical reference for just a moment, back your mind up a little earlier in time in that, when Paul the Apostle was Saul of Tarsus. And he and others thought the best way to stop the gospel was to wreak havoc on who? On Christians. If we punish them, if we imprison them, if we kill them, we'll stymie or slow down the progress of the gospel. But what actually happened? It actually spread. They scattered the Christians back to their homelands, and when they went back to their homelands, they took the gospel with them. The very thing they thought would hurt the gospel actually became one of the greatest catalysts to the spread of the gospel that the world had seen to that point. Same thing here. They're convinced in their minds, if we can keep Paul in prison, then we can slow, in their minds, his version of the gospel. But he says, don't worry about me. I've been able to continue to preach and teach. The furtherance of the gospel has continued, note verse 13 at it, so that my bonds in Christ are manifest in all the palace and in all other places. So, if you end up in prison, you're most likely going to have a series of what? Not just going to leave you there. You're going to get a chance. You're a Roman citizen. Remember, that's the appeal that he made to begin with that got this process going. When they're about to bring consequence to him while he was back in Jerusalem, he says, whoa. Is it okay to beat a man who's a Roman citizen who hasn't been given the proper court proceedings in order to do that? They put on the brakes, right? And make ready for him to be able to travel to Rome. So while he's in prison, he's going back and forth from the courtroom. They bring him in and discuss, why is this man in prison? What purpose has he been brought before us? And why are people feeling threatened by him? And is he really a threat to Caesar? And is he trying to set up a kingdom that is in opposition to? So he's in and out of the courtroom, the palace. I don't know that palace here is the imagery of a place where a king resides so much as a seat of authority when the word palace is used here. And so I've been in and out of many places, including the seats of authority. And interestingly, his defense against the notion that he's a threat to Caesar would be the gospel itself. Every time he's set to defense, every time he's given an opportunity to defend himself, what he does is he just preaches the gospel. This is what the gospel is really about. It's about a kingdom not of this world. It's about a kingdom who has a heavenly king. It's about a kingdom whose king sits at the right hand of God. This isn't about Caesar and another kingdom. This isn't about some fleshly or earthly conflict. So every time he gets drug into the courtroom, he gets to preach the gospel. Every time he's presented to another authority or an upper echelon of another court, he gets to preach the gospel. Because it is his defense in relationship to the charges that are being made against him. And so as this progresses, note verse 14, that many of the brethren in the Lord, waxing confident by my bonds, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. So others are witnessing what's going on with Paul. And they see, number one, he's still what? He's still alive, right? So one of the greatest confidence builders, I'm sure, to others is, okay, he's in prison, but so far he's been able to convince them that he's deserving to live. And the longer Paul is able to continue in that fashion, the bolder many of those who he taught and shared the gospel with become. Their confidence is rising. The longer Paul gets these opportunities, the longer he continues to be able to present the message of the gospel without too much harm or problems arising for him, good things are happening. And so lots of people are being encouraged and emboldened by the fact that they really have yet to address Paul in very specific ways. And they bring him in and out of courtrooms, in and out of the palaces, places of authority. And Paul keeps preaching. And so others are being encouraged to do the same. Yeah. Yeah, you've got the Apostle Paul among you in terms of church. And some of them may very well have been in prison for the very same reasons he was. And I think he'll talk about some of his fellow laborers in various letters who were in prison with him because of their stand with the gospel as well. Yeah, he seems to be at different times. You go back into the book of Acts and you look at some of the narratives as it relates to there are times where he's given liberty to refresh himself with his friends and others. And so there seems to be a more house arrest kind of approach maybe to Paul than in the deepest, darkest dungeon of a prison. And yeah. I'm not arguing that. Yeah. It's amazing, Ed, when we think about that, because apparently he had spoken enough, talked enough, and they had been around him long enough that he had even brought confidence in them. And all the decision making they had done wasn't working so well. Let's listen. He probably knows. And he told them, if you'll listen to what I'm telling you, you'll be all right. And the ones who didn't are challenged. Yeah, it's interesting, but it does raise an interesting facet about the man, the character of the man. We don't necessarily see it in specifics like we would if we were face to face with him, but you see it in the results. That there are lots of folks that are allowing themselves to be influenced by him and are encouraged by him in those things. Yeah. Imagine that Caesar, what he believes and what they teach, and all these things are among them. And Paul taught them. Yeah, and his influence is growing, even among the influential, through being a prisoner. It's really amazing when you think about it, and that's the way God can function, even in difficult times. Yeah. 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 And that the effects of his prison work is becoming more far-reaching than you ever would have thought it could have been. And lots of people are becoming bolder and bolder in their confidence to go ahead and continue to preach, even though there may be some threatening issues happening around them. But here's what's interesting then. He said he'll describe over the next few verses two different kinds of folks that are promoting the message of Jesus. He said, some, verse 15, indeed preach Christ, even of envy and strife. So, some people are preaching Christ, but the motives aren't right. They're disappointed that Paul's still able to continue to preach, particularly, and most argue, that the most prominent folks who would have for lack of a better description, a stake in Christianity, but yet not fully committed to it, would have been those Judaizing teachers that are seemingly everywhere, who want to have this hybrid version of Christianity, where they get to keep certain aspects of the Old Testament law, particularly what things were they interested in. Circumcision was was really the biggest one, and one of the deepest concerns that they had, and tried to keep that Old Testament aspect as a Christian, a rule within Christianity. If you recall, the apostles had to deal with some things in Antioch. They basically came up with some kind of 4 principles to encourage others to appreciate. But those folks are frustrated because they could have gained more influence if Paul would have just went into the good night and no one else had opportunity to hear him speak. He didn't have an audience. Well, remember, go back in your mind to when we studied the book of Ephesians. We studied the book of Ephesians. The entire book seemed to be this comparison and contrast, one verse after another, trying to get Jew and Gentile to realize they needed to be one in Christ, and that neither one had a better position as it relates to Christ than the other. The Gentiles had worldly issues that they needed to address. The Jews had religious conflicts and challenges they needed to address. So there are those who out of envy and strife, not out of good motives, but whose name are they proclaiming? Proclaiming the name of Christ. Even though their motives are wrong, and even though their intents and purposes may not be wrong, some of them were doing it that way, and some also of what? Of goodwill. Some bad motives and bad intentions, others with the right intention, the right will, the right motivation and purpose. He continues that contrast. Now, I'll just mention to you quickly here, if you have an American Standard, probably English Standard, I think as well. There's a handful. There are some manuscripts. Anybody know? Well, that's King James on the screen. Anybody notice anything different between what you might have in your hands and the way that reads in verses 16 and 17? Dora says she can't read it. Hang on. There you go. Oh, I was saying it in front of them. That don't help either. There you go. Here, I thought I was being helpful when I was just being a smart aleck to myself, I guess. But anybody notice anything? Well, I guess maybe I don't have to worry about it. Okay, they're flipped, right? They're flipped. If you depending on what translation you have in your hands, they may be flipped. Verse 16 may actually be verse 17, and verse 17 may be actually verse 16. In some translations, they talk about those preaching out of love in verse 16. And in others, some of them flip verses 16 and 17. Now, maybe none of you have those translations in your hands, and we can just move on. But I wanted to notice that with you. It's not a change in the message. It's not a change in purpose. It's not a change in function. It's not a change in doctrine. It's not a change in anything. It's just some of the manuscripts had it flipped. And so depending on which manuscripts were predominantly used, depending on the translation you have in your hands, would determine which of those verses went first in what order. King James has it, the one preached Christ of contention, not sincerely, supposing to add affliction to my bonds. It mentions it first. And then in verse 17, but the other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. And sometimes they flip those. But the principles hold true. So some of the folks who are preaching this, they're preaching Christ of contention. They're doing it with contentious motives. They're trying to stir up trouble for Paul. Well, think about that. If you're going contentious, you're preaching Jesus, but you're going to try to stir up trouble for Paul, how would you do that? Because he's preaching Jesus too. So if I want Paul to stay in prison, and I want him to, as quickly as I can get his voice silenced, because I don't like the way he preaches Jesus, because he doesn't preach circumcision as a law anymore, because he doesn't preach various aspects of things that I'd like to keep in my doctrine, and so I'd like him to keep Paul in prison, maybe just do away with him, and then his voice will be gone. Then I try to stir up the Romans to think, no, wait a minute. He says he's preaching Jesus, but this is really what Jesus is about. Yeah. And so they're using they're believers in Jesus as the Messiah, but they're not willing to embrace the purity of the gospel. That's the word sincerely there, not purely. That's the definition of the Greek word there. Not pure. There's not a purity to their message. There's a central figure that's equivalent in their message, but they're not doing it sincerely, with purity. Yeah, it's about them, in other words, and it's about what they want to have presented, rather than a willingness to adhere to what Jesus had actually preached. Yeah, yeah. The Judaizing teacher, in very simplistic terms, wanted to embrace Jesus as the Messiah, as the coming one, as the one they had been. They just weren't ready to vacate all those traditions and customs and law of the Old Testament, and so they're trying to blend the two. And so they're supposing that if they continue to promote that version, that's a poor choice of words, but their thoughts as it relates to Jesus coupled with Jewish law, that somehow they'll create greater problems for Paul. That's their purpose. Not sincerity, not love for the truth, not a desire to promote the gospel. Their intent is solely to try to cause as much difficulty and trouble for Paul as they can. And they believe they could do that if they preach a different variation, there's a better word, a different variation of the message of Jesus than what Paul was preaching. Yeah. 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 And the challenge Paul has is if these folks can convince the Romans that Paul's not preaching the truth about Jesus and about the Mosaic law as it relates. And if you can't believe him on that, then I wouldn't believe him about whether he's really leading an earthly or a heavenly kingdom or not. The issue isn't they don't have to convince the Romans that in direct ways that Paul's a threat to them. If they can just get the Romans to believe that Paul has lied to them, then the wall of trust breaks down. And now, well, I don't know. He says it's an earthly or not an earthly kingdom that he's working for, and he says it's a heavenly king, but he's lying about this. Maybe he'd be lying about that as well. So they're crafty in their methods to try to create greater burdens for Paul. Well, I think they are, and from the strictest definition of anti-Jesus, anti-Christ. They're in opposition to the purity of the message of Jesus. Yeah, they're against Christ, and I think there is a much more general understanding of that term antichrist. We have it visioned almost as a single person sometimes, but it's anyone who's doing things that are contentious and creating challenges towards the cause of Christ. Anti-Christ, therefore the name. Yeah, against. Yep. So there's an opposite group, though. The other of love, knowing that I am set for the defense of the gospel. The others are preaching Christ in the same purity, in the same truth, with the same love, the same level of sincerity that Paul is. And they do that knowing that Paul, imprisonment's not going to change the message for Paul. Threat of bodily harm, life, whatever it is, Paul's not going to change the structure of the gospel to save his own personal situation. And so again, they're just growing bolder and bolder. They're continuing to preach in love. And they know that I'm set for the defense of the gospel. I'm ready to do that. I'm ready to defend the truth as need be. Go ahead. I'm just looking at something. I'm trying to make sure I remember. Yeah. And I think, Randy, and maybe what's happened with some of that, um, and I'm cautious. The problem is those words. Uh, the question really is, and you understand, are they preaching truth? And there's not really. We use those terms sometimes, liberal, conservative, but the problem with those nowadays, by the way, just for insight, um, they're not defined the same way. And we might be an anti to somebody else who says they're conservative and somebody else is more liberal than them. I sat in a lectureship one time where it was one of the oddest things I ever heard, because the first speaker kind of talked about himself as just being a little more conservative than the guy that spoke before him. And the next guy said, well, I'm just a little more conservative than the guy that spoke with, and I'm just a little bit more, and it's true. And by the time that they got to the end of that conversation, the last guy in the chain, to try to find somebody more liberal-minded than him, he went to Locato. That's how, you know what I mean? He had to go that far to try to. And my point is maybe we need to challenge one another to say, do we preach the truth or not? Let's preach the truth, and let's not talk about whether, you know what I mean. Let's be careful that we don't get into. And I'm not saying you were. I'm just saying be careful we don't get into these shades of conservatism and shades of liberalism and shades of this or shade and the various hierarchy that some men create when it comes to those things. And here's why I say it, Rand. I don't mean to interrupt you, because here's what happens sometimes. Some folks will convince themselves, so as long as I'm associated with a group who defines themselves as conservative, I'm good. And that may not be the case, because I can define myself as conservative, or you know what I mean. I can define myself in any of those labels that I want to. So notice what Paul said. Some weren't preaching the truth, and some were preaching the truth. And we need to stay in fellowship with those who are preaching the truth, and stay consistent with that. And maybe I'm. Yeah. 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 If the effort is to be New Testament Christians, then let's be New Testament Christians, and that's the source by which we go to. That's truth, and that's to be that, as it relates and to those things. But with that said, notice something in verse 18. He says, "What then?" Question mark. He's asking a question. "Notwithstanding, every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is preached, and I therein do rejoice, yea, and will rejoice." Now, did he approve of those who preached Christ out of envy, strife, and contention? Did he approve of them? I want you to stop and think about what I'm asking you. The answer, I believe you're right. Some of you are shaking your heads. No, he's not saying that it's okay. It's okay. It's okay for them to preach out of strife and envy. It's okay for them to be contentious. It's okay for them to try to cause harm to me. It's all right. That's not what he said. What he said was, Jesus may be by some folks being preached by pretense and contentious and strifeful ways. Others are doing it out of truth, with sincerity, with love, with the right motives and purpose. And I'll rejoice that who's being talked about? That Christ is being talked about. This statement, and the only point I'm trying to make sure we understand from this, is his statement, I don't believe, I could be wrong, but I don't believe his statement is about who's approved and who's not approved out of these two groups. His statement is about, if people are talking about Jesus, good can come. If his name is being brought forth, even if the initiator of that conversation might be causing trouble. I could anecdotally, by the way, start listing you names of people I personally know who are now believers and followers of Jesus, who initially got into conversations about Jesus for negative reasons. Folks that wanted to argue against Jesus. Folks who wanted to fight and resist Christianity. And their discussions about Jesus initially weren't for good reasons. But ultimately good came as they began to see the Scriptures differently. And they began to view Jesus differently. And they left. And so I believe that's all Paul's saying. Yeah. 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 And I think that Christy, with that, one of the things that it's always been in the back of my mind as a preacher, and maybe even more as a believer. It frustrates me when people speak wrongly about Jesus. It frustrates me when people present Jesus in inaccurate ways, in ways that the Bible wouldn't honor or wouldn't validate. But you know what really scares me? Nobody talking about Him at all. The day we reach the point where nobody even talks about Him is the day we're really in trouble. Because that's the day people have just determined that He's not even worth discussing. That's the really scary stage. So be frustrated when truth is being trampled on. Be frustrated when you're trying to defend the gospel and there seems to be countermeasures on every side. But be concerned when people have managed to eradicate His name from every conversation. That's when we're in real trouble. When you can't even talk about Him anymore. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry, I'll come back to you, Pam. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yep. Yep. And I agree with you, Pam. I think that there's we've often, we refer sometimes to the United States being a Christian nation. And again, some of the concern maybe that we should have is as fewer and fewer people even want His name brought forth is a more concerning issue. But you're right. Even though there may be discrepancies or issues that arise from the purity of truth, people are still benefited if Jesus is still in their conscience on a regular basis. And so long as they're willing to discuss Jesus, then there's still hope that those other things can be addressed and talked about. But if we reach a point where Jesus is no longer a part of the narrative, I'm not talking about Him at all. Now we have no opportunity whatsoever at that point. Paul says, "For I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ." I believe what he means by that is not his salvation eternally. I think he means his salvation from this imprisonment. He believes that this opportunity to continue to go back in the courtroom and keep having opportunity to tell them I'm not an apostle of an earthly kingdom. I'm not trying to raise up a sect of the Nazarenes or any other group that are going to go out and be a resistance to the Roman government. And every time he in his mind, he's convinced that these are the things that will ultimately lead to his physical salvation, his opportunity to escape this imprisonment. For I know that this shall turn to my salvation through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit of Jesus Christ. According to my earnest expectation and my hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. So, Paul says, I rejoice that Jesus is still being talked about, no matter what the reason. It has encouraged him to know that others have been emboldened to declare the message of Jesus, despite the fact that one of the main figures in that cause has been in this imprisonment. And he says he has certain expectations, certain hopes. He's not backing away from it. Generally speaking, it might, in most people's eyes, be something shameful to be a prisoner. But Paul says, not for the sake of the gospel. This isn't, no shame here, but with boldness, as I've always done. And so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. Paul believes that his continual opportunity to present the gospel will eventually be to his salvation. Paul has expectation and hope that he'll eventually escape from this circumstance. His letter to Philemon is validation of that. Paul has boldness because of this confidence that he's reached. But at the end of the day, he says what about life and death? Yeah, it doesn't affect him. Either way, I have certain expectations. I believe this is going to be salvation. All the positive words that he says. But at the end of it all, basically, he says, though, if it's life, it'll be life, and I'll continue to be who I am and preach and teach and share the message of the gospel. If I die because of the cause, I'm going to continue to preach and teach the gospel in its purity, with its simplicity, and the message that'll bring life to those who hear it. You love his disposition about all this. Positive in terms of what his expectations are, but a recognition that it may not go the way he thinks. And if it doesn't, it'll all still be for the cause of Christ. And at the end of the day, that's his focus. And it's an encouragement to us, and it's a great example for us as well. Yeah. Yeah. And so even with some liberty, there's challenges that return, difficulties that return to him. Biblically, we don't know completely what happens with him beyond a certain point. But even though it did not go as maybe as he had hoped, of course that was a realization for him on many occasions that things didn't go exactly like he might thought they would have. Yeah. Right. And a faith that let him, verse 21 add it, because he says, I'm not concerned, life or death don't concern me. Because if I live, is what? Is Christ. If I continue to live, it's going to be about Jesus, it's going to be about Christ, it's going to be about my honoring Him, preaching His message, encouraging. And to die is what? That's gain. So if I live, I'll continue to be the messenger of Jesus. If I live, I will continue to exemplify what it is to be a child of God and a believer in Jesus. And if I die, I'm going where? I'm going to heaven. I'm going home. I'm going to eternal rest, where I don't have to worry about a Judaizing teacher. I don't have to worry about those who have me imprisoned here. I don't have to worry about keep going into the courtroom and defending myself. And so if there's gain, I'm not. Paul says I'm not concerned about that. If I live in the flesh, verse 22, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I shall choose, I wot not. So this conversation continues: life or death. If I live, it's going to be for Christ. If I die, I'll gain. Eternal home and a resting place for me. If I live in the flesh, verse 22. Then the fruit of my labor will just continue. It just means more opportunity to do good and to help others know about Jesus. None of that will stop. But here's the interesting part. Paul says, though, if the choice was set before him in this moment, he would have what? difficulty deciding. I have full confidence either way. And in some ways, I think he's kind of saying, and I'm glad really that the choice isn't necessarily mine to make. Because if it was his pure decision to make, whether to continue to live and bear fruit and preach the gospel and further a cause of Jesus, that has merit. To die in Christ and receive the reward of his labors has merit. And so if it was a choice where I had the ability to pick A or B, Paul says, I don't know what I would choose. Because there's merit to both. In fact, he says in verse 23, he's what and what? I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful. I want you to stop, let that soak in for a second. There have been a lot of times in our lives, I probably venture to say, where we, maybe not exactly parallel to what Paul's talking about specifically here, but there are probably times where we've had to decide between better and needful. And that's not always easy. It's not always easy to discern. When it's obvious there's a better path, right? There's obvious if I take this path or make these choices or go down this road, I'm better off. It's easier. It's less painful or whatever. It's got greater rewards. It's less hazardous. Anything you want to name. It's a better path to take. But it may not be the most needful path at the time. Sometimes the needful path is the one that looks dark and challenging and difficult and hard. But Paul says that might be what's needed right now. I'd be a lot better off if I just go to heaven. Wouldn't we all? In reality. But sometimes that may be better in terms of comfort and benefit. But Paul says it may not be what's needful in this moment. Yeah, I think Paul in his mind, Tom, is convinced and understands that so long as he has breath, there's reason for that. And he doesn't always know the reasons, right? He believes he'll be saved from this, but he doesn't know for sure. He hopes to go see Philemon, but he doesn't know for sure. But at the end of it all, he's willing to trust in God that if there's breath left in him, that must be what's needful. There's still work to be done, and still things that he can accomplish. And he even says that. He says that very personally, by the way. And I could be overreading this, but notice he said, "Nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you." He's a very kind of direct statement towards those he's writing this letter to. I think Paul very clearly is stating to the Philippian brethren, there's still some needs that you have that I need to fulfill for you. There's still things I need to declare to you and teach you and share with you and help you with. And so it's more needful for me to stay around for a while. Yeah. Yeah. And I believe this brings, I think it brings encouragement to the Philippian brethren. Paul basically said, if this was all about choice, if this is all just about personal choice, I'd choose what's better, right? If it's all about personal choice, then you take what's better. And that's the path that most anybody would take if it was all just about the single individual person. But he basically tells them, but I'm still here, and there's still purpose, and there's still things that I want to fulfill for you. And so verse 25, I have confidence. I have this confidence. I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith. He recognizes the betwixt he's in, the conflict that there is there, the struggle between eternity and the work that still needs to happen here in this life. But Paul seems to be pretty resolved at this moment that there's still things that need to be done. And he's going to be around to do them. Yeah. And Gary, my basic feeling is as a believer, as a child of God, if I'm breathing, I've got a purpose. And that's kind of what... And at times we may have struggle trying to figure out what that is. But, yeah. And sometimes that's hard to sense. And sometimes we're trying to find our way. And maybe because we create a hierarchy of what we believe is really good work and what's meaningless. There's nothing meaningless. There's no act of kindness. There's no act of encouragement. There's no act of service that is rendered for the cause of Christ or to benefit others. None of it's meaningless. None of that is purposeless. And no, we're not going to reach the opportunities and the magnitude of the work that the Apostle Paul has reached. That's why he's the Apostle Paul. His opportunities and purposes are going to be far different in its specifics than us. But we can still find a purpose. And it's never too small to fulfill. And it's never insignificant. Yeah. And I think that we just need to be cautious to not create a hierarchy of good. And these things are really good, and these things are okay. It's all good. If it's good, it's good. And can be honored that way. So I have confidence that I'm going to further your joy of faith, and that your rejoicing in verse 26 may be more abundant in Jesus Christ for me by my coming to you again. Again, his hope is to be present with them again. And if that happens, he says, here's what to do in the meantime. Only let your conversation be as it becometh the gospel of Christ, that whether I come and see you or else be absent, I may hear of your affairs, that ye stand fast in one spirit, with one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel. And Paul says, here's what I need you to do. I have confidence I'm going to come and see you. I have confidence in the opportunity to be able to be with you. All that's been said. But either way, here's what I want to hear about you. Either way, I want to know that you're living in your conversation, and your conduct is becoming of the gospel. I want to hear about your faith. I want to hear, when I hear of your affairs, I want to hear that you're standing fast in one spirit. I want to hear about the positive things that are coming and happening from within the congregation there in Philippi. That's Paul says, either direction. Whatever I hear of you, I want to hear good things. Whether I'm able to come and see those things for myself or not. Paul was really trying to embolden and encourage the church of Philippi to do the right things. And to live as becometh Christianity. All right. We didn't quite get done. We'll briefly finish up chapter 1 and be able to move into chapter 2, then Lord willing, on Sunday.